some nights, some live, some die, and the way of the sound.
Hello, Internet! Vinnie D coming to you here live from the Fortress of Fragitude. And welcome to another episode of Vinnie Rants. Today, Vinnie's gonna rant about swords. More specifically, we're gonna rant about one particular sword, Katanas. Superior Nippon steel folded 1,000,000 times, cut through gaijin blade like paper. Chances are, if you're a fan of sharp things, someone has approached you and talked about katanas. Katanas are the greatest sword in the world. They'll cut through armor like hot butter. Folded millions of times by spiritually enlightened blacksmiths, the weapon of the samurai, distilled into a perfect form over thousands of generations of isolation. It can chop through other swords. It'll slice up armor, cut down gun barrels, cut bullets out of midair. In fact, it's so sharp it can cut you without even actually touching you. The katana, supreme among all swords. Or is it? Katanas, made with inferior iron sand, the only kind of metal they could even get in Japan. Katanas break after 3 uses, bend if they hit bone. Katanas, a curved slicing sword pointlessly made two-handed. Katanas, the edge is so brittle it chips if you look at it hard. And like anything, when you see diametrically opposed views like this, the truth usually lies somewhere in between. So let's break down the katana, its history, metallurgy, and use in Japan, and how it compares to the rest of the world. The katana's form is heavily influenced by the Sengoku Jidai era of Japan, also known as the Warring States era. This is when the katana began to evolve from its older ancestor, the tachi. The tachi is very similar to the katana, having a long curved body and a two-handed hilt. However, the tachi also had a much more aggressive curve, which is important to a slicing sword to present more edge. It also had a longer and continuously curved hilt, which is better for leverage. The tachi was a true war sword, which would have been a much more useful design in the warlike era of the Sengoku Jidai. However, as the Sengoku Jidai gave way to the Tokugawa shogunate and led into the Edo period, there was suddenly a lot less warfare in Japan. The samurai class heavily contracted, and their blades became less of a weapon of the battlefield, and more of a symbol of rank, and the occasional dueling weapon, and sidearm when putting down the occasional rebellion. The curve of the blade became less severe, the handle got shorter and straighter. And this is where the form of the katana as we know it came to be. Why did the katana change form? One could say, aesthetic beauty. The design became more and more dogmatic, as the katana became more and more a symbol rather than weapon. Remember, when a samurai went into battle, he was on horseback, rarely using his sword. No, the samurai would wield the yari, his spear, and the yumi, his bow. When a samurai had to draw his sword, it means he was dismounted, either knocked from his horse, or to face another samurai in a one-on-one duel. Here the katana came out as a ceremonial dueling weapon, where 2 equals squared off. And given this significance, is it any wonder their blades became mythologized? Much like the long swords of European knights, they became the stuff of legends. But in all practicality, on the open battlefield, you really didn't want to be down to just your sword. No, you wanted your hands on a nice big two-handed weapon, a nice long spear, or even better a bow. Well out of reach for him to stick you with the pointy end. And under the absolute power of the shogun, katanas became an even more rare and special symbol of rank, as ordinary commoners and even merchants were forbidden from owning one. So, Even to the people in its own country of origin, the katana could appear to be something special and exotic. And when trade finally opened up to the West, of course, anything not made in Europe is made of some legendary steel that can slice through anything, of course, right? It's that exotic quality that leads to a whole lot of exaggeration. But by no means should you underestimate the wielders of these blades. Looking at the shape of the katana, you can tell right away that, like any curved sword, this is a slicing blade. The curve presents more edge, and that allows for a longer draw cut, ideal for slicing through soft targets. Not so ideal for piercing armored targets. And that says a lot for what you're going to expect to fight while wielding a katana. Not a fully armored opponent where you're hunting gaps in one another's armor. No, you're either cutting down rebellious peasants, or facing each other one-on-one in a duel of honor. And the martial arts, Kenjutsu, Kendo, and Iaido, are well designed to use this weapon to its maximum efficiency. Lastly, let's talk about the metallurgy. How these swords are made, the myths and realities, and how these blacksmithing methods are used to make the absolute best of the resources Japan had available. First of all, let's talk about these resources. In Japan, you weren't going to find a great big hunk of iron ore. No, sadly, Japan is a very metal-poor land. What they did have was iron sand, from which the iron had to be extracted under extremely high heat. The result was a mixture of different levels of carbon steel. Very high carbon steel, known as tamahagane, and very low carbon steel, and often with very uneven distribution. The smith very carefully selected out his steels, and this is where the famous folding process came into play. Folding, more commonly known under blacksmiths today as pattern welding, was a method where the steel was formed, flattened out, folded over, and formed again. This had the result of making a more homogeneous steel. And homogeny is very important to making a strong blade. This got us an even carbon distribution across the ingot before you began to work on the blade. Your high carbon steel is going to still be high carbon, and your low carbon is still going to be low carbon, but that carbon is evenly distributed amongst each, and that is very important. That's what the folding process accomplishes, and produces the strongest blades Japan knew. Now, today we have monotemper steels, with almost perfectly even carbon content across the entire ingot. But in medieval Japan, this process produced something amazing for its time. However, we aren't done yet. You still have some very even carbon distribution across two very different steels. Now, I want to take a moment to point out that there weren't a million folds. No, if you did that, your layers of steel would become far too thin and your blade would become brittle. However, remember that every time you fold a piece of steel, just like a piece of paper or anything else really, your number of layers doubles each time. In reality, the folds were maybe 12 to 20. 20 being the extreme end produced by only the very best blacksmiths. Now, the hard steel, the high carbon, was begun to be formed into its beginning shapes, drawn out long, then folded into a V, whereupon the softer steel was inserted. Think like the old way Subway used to cut their sandwiches. Does anybody else remember that, or is that just me? Sliding that soft steel into the hard steel, just like a hot dog into the bun. The soft steel became the spine of the blade, while the outer body and the edge were formed by the hard steel, and then at last the blade could finally be shaped. And when finally quenched from its hot forge, part of the blade was covered in clay, in order to cool it more slowly, producing a differential temper. This allowed the back of the blade to be a more moderate hardness, neither so brittle it would snap, nor so soft it would bend easily, while allowing the very edge to be as hard as possible, taking the keenest of edges. When at last it was complete, you had a blade that would hold a razor's edge, yet the body of the blade could still withstand shock. Compared to weapons of inferior quality, these were the finest blades in the land. However, they were not perfect. That razor-sharp edge was still vulnerable to chipping if it hit something too hard. That shock-absorbing spine? Well, Japan never really got spring tempering right the way Europe did. While European swords will flex and return to form, the spine of the katana is still vulnerable to bending if torqued the wrong way, and once bent, it will stay bent. But certainly the blades were still vastly superior to things with uneven carbon content, or that didn't have differential temper. When a better-made blade meets an inferior blade, and the inferior blade snaps, you can start to see where the legends of them cutting through other metals might have come from. And given the samurai enjoyed their lofty status, they probably encouraged these legends. So what can I say of the katana? Are they the greatest weapon of all time? No. Are they cheap trash weapons that will break the first time they see real use? Also no. Like most weapons throughout history, the katana is something that evolved along with its land to become something ideally suited for the region from which it came. Just as the knight's longsword was ideal for fighting other armored foes, the sailor's cutlass was ideal for fighting while boarding ships and not getting itself stuck in floorboards. The rapier was built for one-on-one duels. The katana served well in its purpose of dueling other samurai, or, in the battlefield, being that last-ditch weapon when your bow and spear had failed you, and for being a day-to-day carry for the samurai, as symbol of his lofty rank. In the end, neither should the katana be judged unfairly for failing to compete in areas it was never intended to compete in, nor should it be falsely elevated above what it truly was. And that's no reason you shouldn't admire the fascinating history from which it came, or the amazing blacksmithing techniques that made it both beautiful and functional. That's all I've got to say about katanas. Until next time, this is Vinnie D, signing out. Be good.